World War I is remembered as a war of loss. Lost lives, lost empires, and lost generations. But what if I told you that while millions died in the trenches, a small group quietly became unimaginably rich? They didn't fight, they didn't bleed. Yet when the war ended, they controlled the world's money, industry, and future. This is the story history rarely tells. The hidden economic winners of World War I. If you enjoy deep, untold history that explains how our modern world was shaped, subscribe now. This story will change how you see global power forever. In 1914, the world stood at a dangerous crossroads. Europe was powerful, confident, and deeply divided. Empires dominated the map. The British Empire, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Empire. These were not just political powers. They were economic giants, controlling trade routes, resources, and global finance. Before the war, Europe was the financial center of the world. London was the heart of global banking. Paris funded railways across continents. Berlin fueled industry with unmatched efficiency. Most international loans, investments, and insurance contracts passed through European hands. The United States, by comparison, was still a rising power. Wealthy, yes, but not yet dominant. American banks were smaller. The dollar was not the world's reserve currency. In fact, the US depended heavily on European capital. Then came the gunshots in Sarajevo. What followed was not just a military conflict, it was an economic earthquake. As armies mobilized, governments needed money, massive amounts of it. Weapons, uniforms, ships, food, ammunition, war. Consumed resources at a scale never seen before. And here's the critical truth most people miss. War is the fastest way to destroy old wealth and create new wealth. European governments drained their treasuries. Gold reserves vanished. Entire economies shifted from civilian production to military survival. Factories that once produced consumer goods were converted into weapon plants. Trade routes collapsed. Insurance risks skyrocketed. Inflation began to spread. But while Europe burned, somewhere else, profits were quietly exploding. Across the Atlantic, the United States remained officially neutral for nearly 3 years. And neutrality was not weakness, it was opportunity. American factories stayed intact. American workers stayed alive. American banks stayed open. As Europe fought, the US supplied food.steel, coal.oil, weapons, medical supplies. By 1916, the United States had become the industrial warehouse of the Allied powers. British and French governments borrowed heavily, not from their own banks, but from American financiers. This was the moment the balance of economic power began to shift. Not with bombs, not with soldiers, but with loans, contracts, and interest rates. By the time the US entered the war in 1917, the transformation was already underway. Europe was drowning in debt. America was becoming the world's creditor. And the winners were not generals, they were bankers, industrialists, and corporations who understood one simple rule. Wars end, debts don't. And when the war finally ended, the real battle for global economic dominance was just beginning. When World War I ended in 1918, the world celebrated peace. But behind the celebrations was a brutal economic reality. Europe was broken. Entire cities lay in ruins. Infrastructure was destroyed. Millions of workers were dead or permanently injured. Industries that once powered empires were shattered beyond quick repair. And most devastating of all, Europe was bankrupt. To finance the war, Britain and France had sold off overseas assets, drained gold reserves, and borrowed enormous sums, primarily from the United States. By 1919, something unprecedented had happened. The United States had transformed from a debtor nation into the world's largest creditor. This single shift would reshape the global economy for the next century. American banks now held Europe's financial lifeline. The future of entire nations depended on US loans, repayment schedules, and interest terms. And American industry thrived like never before. During the war, US manufacturing output had surged. Steel production doubled. Oil exports exploded. Chemical and arms industries expanded at historic speed. Companies that supplied the war effort emerged as industrial giants, dominating markets long after the fighting stopped. Meanwhile, European competitors struggled to restart production, buried under debt and political instability. The dollar began to rise. Gold flowed into American vaults. New York replaced London as the financial center of the world, quietly but decisively. Yet here's the uncomfortable truth rarely discussed in history books. America didn't need to conquer territory. It conquered influence. Loans came with conditions. Debt created dependency. Economic recovery required obedience to financial terms set far from European capitals. This was not empire building through armies. It was empire building through balance sheets. At the same time, a new elite class was forming. Bankers, financiers, and corporate executives gained power that rivaled governments. Their decisions shaped currencies, employment, and political stability across continents. And the war had proven something dangerous. Modern wars reward those who control production and finance, not those who fight. As Europe struggled with revolutions, inflation, and political collapse, America surged forward into what would later be called the Roaring Twenties. But beneath the surface of prosperity, the seeds of the next global disaster were already being planted. Because when wealth concentrates too fast, when debt becomes unpayable, and when power shifts without stability, history never stays silent for long. In the next segments, we'll uncover how corporations, banks, and even entire industries secretly engineered long-term dominance from World War I, and how their power still shapes your life today. Subscribe, and continue this journey into the hidden architecture of global power. When soldiers returned home from the trenches, many believed the war was finally over. But for certain industries, the war never really ended. In fact, it had only just begun. World War I proved something chilling. War could be industrialized, standardized, and monetized. For the first time in history, mass destruction became a business model. Arms manufacturers were no longer small workshops. They were massive corporations capable of supplying entire nations. Factories ran day and night, producing rifles, artillery, ammunition, tanks, and chemical weapons at industrial scale. And once these industries expanded, they could never shrink again, because peace was bad for business. During the war, governments signed enormous long-term contracts. Prices were guaranteed. Profits were protected. Risk was transferred from corporations to taxpayers. If a weapon failed, the government paid. If demand dropped, governments stockpiled. If costs increased, contracts were adjusted. This was capitalism without consequences. In the United States, industrial titans emerged stronger than ever. Steel producers, chemical manufacturers, oil suppliers, and shipping companies experienced record profits. And unlike Europe, American factories were never bombed. Their infrastructure remained untouched, their labor force intact, their production lines modernized by wartime demand. By the early 1920s, these companies had something no one else did. Advanced machinery, skilled labor, global supply networks, political influence. War had turned them into monopolies. But the most disturbing part wasn't the money. It was the lesson learned. Executives and financiers realized that conflict didn't need to be avoided. It could be managed, predicted, and exploited. Weapons manufacturers lobbied governments. Banks financed rearmament. Chemical companies pivoted from gas warfare to industrial dominance. The same factories that once produced poison gas now produced fertilizers, plastics, and pharmaceuticals, quietly integrating themselves into everyday civilian life. War profits were laundered into peaceful industries, and the public never noticed. By the time people began questioning the morality of war profiteering, it was already too late. Because these corporations were no longer just businesses, they were too big to fail, and too powerful to challenge. But the real winners weren't the factories. They were the ones who financed them. Wars destroy nations, but debt controls them. After World War I, Europe faced an impossible dilemma. To rebuild, countries needed money. To get money, they needed loans. To repay loans, they needed economic growth. But growth was strangled by debt. This was the trap. International banks, especially in the United States, became the gatekeepers of recovery. Loans came with conditions. Interest accumulated. Deadlines loomed, and failure was not an option. If a country defaulted, its currency collapsed. Trade halted. Political instability followed. So governments complied. Public spending was cut. Taxes were raised. Workers suffered. All to serve as debt created by war. This system created a new kind of power, financial domination without occupation. No armies were needed. No flags were planted. Control came through spreadsheets and signatures. At the center of this system were international banking networks that operated beyond borders. They financed governments on one side of the war, and reconstruction on the other. They won no matter the outcome. Even reparations, intended to punish defeated nations, became financial tools. Germany, forced to pay enormous sums, borrowed money from foreign banks just to make payments. Money flowed in circles. Banks collected interest at every step. And the pressure created resentment, nationalism, and instability, especially in defeated nations. This was not accidental. Economic chaos created opportunity. Currencies collapsed. Assets were sold cheaply. Foreign investors stepped in, buying industries, land, and infrastructure at fractions of their real value. A silent transfer of wealth occurred, from nations to financiers, from governments to private capital, from public hands to elite control. By the mid-1920s, the world economy looked stable on the surface. But underneath, it was fragile, unequal, and dangerously overlapped. The architects of this system believed they had mastered global finance. They believed they could control risk. They were wrong. Because the same system that created immense wealth was about to collapse spectacularly. And when it did, the consequences would dwarf even the devastation of World War I. In the next segments, we'll expose how this financial system helped ignite the Great Depression, and how the same elites positioned themselves to profit from the next global catastrophe. Subscribe now. The most shocking chapters are still ahead. After the guns fell silent, the victors of World War I believed they had secured peace. But what they actually built was an economic time bomb. At the heart of it was the Treaty of Versailles, a document remembered for redrawn borders and political humiliation, but far more dangerous for its financial consequences. Germany, declared responsible for the war, was ordered to pay massive reparations. The numbers were staggering, far beyond what its shattered economy could realistically afford. And yet, the payments were demanded anyway. To understand why this mattered, you must understand one brutal truth of modern economics. Money doesn't disappear. Pressure does not vanish. It moves. Unable to pay from tax revenue or exports, Germany turned to borrowing. When borrowing wasn't enough, it turned to printing money. At first, the solution seemed painless. But soon prices began to rise. Then they exploded. By the early 1920s, Germany entered one of the most extreme cases of hyperinflation in human history. Savings evaporated overnight. Wages became worthless by the hour. Workers were paid twice a day just to buy bread before prices doubled again. Middle-class families, the backbone of society, were wiped out. And while ordinary people suffered, something else was happening quietly in the background. Those with access to hard assets, foreign currency, and financial connections were protected. Factories, land, and businesses were sold for fractions of their real value. Foreign investors stepped in, purchasing entire industries at discount prices. This was not accidental chaos. Economic collapse creates forced sellers, and forced sellers always benefit buyers with liquidity. Once again, wealth flowed upward and outward, away from citizens, toward financial elites. Meanwhile, the Allied nations faced their own trap. Britain and France depended on German reparations to repay their war debts to the United States. When Germany couldn't pay, the entire system trembled. So, more loans were issued. More debt was layered onto debt. The global economy became a fragile pyramid, balanced on promises, interest payments, and political denial. Everyone pretended the system was working. Because admitting failure would mean acknowledging that the economic peace after World War I was never designed for stability. It was designed for extraction. And history was about to collect the price. In 1929, the illusion finally shattered. The Great Depression did not begin in Europe. It began in the United States, the very nation that had emerged as the world's financial winner after World War I. Stock markets collapsed. Banks failed. Credit froze. The global system built on war debt and speculative growth imploded. Factories closed. Trade collapsed. Unemployment spread like a disease across continents. For ordinary people, it was economic apocalypse. But history often hides an uncomfortable pattern. Crises do not affect everyone equally. While millions lost jobs, homes, and savings, certain institutions survived, and some even strengthened their position. Large banks consolidated power, smaller competitors failed and were absorbed. Corporations with government contracts secured bailouts, subsidies, and protection. Once again, risk was socialized. Losses were shared by the public. Survival was reserved for the powerful. Governments intervened not to dismantle the system, but to preserve it. Emergency policies stabilized currencies. Central banks gained new authority. Financial regulation expanded, but carefully, never threatening core power structures. And from the ashes of collapse, a new economic order slowly began to form. One where governments and financial institutions became permanently intertwined. One where economic planning replaced free market illusions. One where war was no longer an exception, but a tool of recovery. As the 1930s progressed, the lesson became brutally clear. Peace had failed to restore growth, but war had succeeded before. Factories needed orders, workers needed wages, industries needed demand, and governments remembered what World War I had taught them. That total war could mobilize economies like nothing else. As nations rearmed, production returned. Employment rose. Capital flowed again. The world was preparing for another catastrophe, and for the same hidden winners, another opportunity. In the next segments, we'll reveal how the economic lessons of World War I directly shaped World War II, and how the same financial elites positioned themselves to emerge even more powerful than before. Subscribe now. The final chapters will connect everything. By the mid-1930s, the world faced a grim realization. Peace had failed. The global economy built after World War I, fueled by debt, reparations, and fragile financial agreements, had collapsed under its own weight. The Great Depression shattered confidence in markets, governments, and institutions alike. Unemployment soared, trade evaporated. Entire societies lost faith in democracy and free markets. But inside government offices, corporate boardrooms, and financial institutions, a different conversation was taking place. A dangerous conclusion was forming. If peace could not restart the economy, war might. World War I had proven something extraordinary. Total war could mobilize entire nations, absorb unemployment, revive industry, and justify unlimited government spending. Factories didn't ask questions when governments ordered tanks instead of tractors. Banks didn't hesitate when loans were guaranteed by the state. Workers didn't protest when survival depended on wages from war production. War turned economic chaos into structured demand. And this realization reshaped global strategy. In Germany, economic humiliation, hyperinflation, and mass unemployment created fertile ground for radical solutions. Rearmament became not only a political goal, but an economic necessity. Factories reopened, jobs returned. Industrial output surged. The same was true elsewhere. In the United States, the New Deal expanded government power, but full economic recovery remained elusive. It was only when military production exploded in the late 1930s and early 1940s that unemployment truly disappeared. In Japan, resource scarcity and economic pressure drove expansionism. In Italy, Militarization masked structural weakness. The pattern was clear. War had become an economic instrument. And behind the scenes, those who controlled capital, production, and logistics were preparing once again. Because, unlike soldiers, they knew exactly what was coming. They had seen it before, and they understood how to profit from it. World War I was no longer just a historical event. It had become a blueprint, a model showing how destruction could be converted into dominance. And the winners were ready to repeat it on an even larger scale. When World War II finally erupted, most people believed it was the failure of diplomacy, nationalism, and ideology. Few recognized it as the final consequence of an economic system designed after World War I, because the true victors of the First War had already learned the most important lesson of the modern age. Territory is temporary. Money is permanent. The hidden winners of World War I were not confined to one nation. They operated across borders, currencies, and political systems. They financed rearmament in one country, reconstruction in another, and profited regardless of ideology. Democracy, fascism, monarchy, it didn't matter. Debt was universal. Contracts were honored. Interest accumulated. This was power without borders. By the late 1930s, global finance and industrial production were no longer tied to national survival. They were tied to perpetual mobilization. Corporations that had survived World War I and the Great Depression were now deeply integrated into state planning. Governments depended on them. Armies relied on them. Entire economies revolved around their output. And once again, risk disappeared upward. Losses were absorbed by nations. Profits were captured by institutions. Ordinary people paid the price. The cycle was complete. World War I had destroyed old empires. World War II would finalize the transfer of power, not from Europe to America alone, but from governments to systems. Systems of finance, systems of production, systems that outlived wars, leaders, and ideologies. By the time the Second War ended, a new global order would emerge, more centralized, more controlled, and more profitable than ever before. And the architects of that order had learned every lesson they needed. From World War I, in the final segments, we'll expose who ultimately consolidated power after both wars and why the global economic system you live in today is the direct descendant of World War I. Subscribe now, the ending reveals everything. When the dust finally settled after 2 world wars, a Great Depression, and the collapse of multiple empires, one thing stood untouched. Not nations, not ideologies, not borders, it was the system. A system born quietly during World War I, refined through crisis, and perfected by World War II. This system did not belong to any single country. It belonged to networks of finance, industry, and influence that learned how to survive every catastrophe by positioning themselves above it. Governments rose and fell. Currencies collapsed and were replaced. But the architecture of economic power remained. At its core was a simple design. Capital flows freely, regardless of borders. Debt binds nations longer than treaties. Crises accelerate consolidation. Risk is absorbed by the public. Profits are protected by structure. World War I revealed this formula for the first time. Banks that financed the war survived its aftermath. Corporations that armed nations survived the peace. Financial institutions that managed debt survived collapse after collapse. Each crisis eliminated smaller players. Each recovery strengthened the survivors. By the mid-20th century, economic power had become systemic, not personal. It no longer depended on kings or presidents, but on institutions too large, too interconnected, and too essential to fail. This was the real victory of World War I. Not military triumph, not territorial gain, but the normalization of a world where economic systems outlived human suffering. And once normalized, it became invisible. People blamed politicians, they blamed nations. They blamed ideologies. Rarely did they blame the system that rewarded instability and punished reform. Because the system was designed to appear neutral, objective, technical. Inevitable, but history tells a different story. Every rule was written by someone. Every institution was created in response to fear. Every financial structure served a purpose and a beneficiary. World War I did not just destroy the old world. It quietly taught the new world how to profit from destruction, and that lesson would echo for generations. World War I ended more than a century ago. But economically, you never left it. Every modern financial institution traces part of its DNA to that conflict. Every global debt system carries its legacy. Every economic crisis follows patterns first revealed between 1914 and 1918. The war taught the world how to turn emergency into opportunity, how to turn chaos into consolidation, how to turn suffering into leverage. And once learned, those lessons were never forgotten. Today, wars may look different. They may be fought with sanctions instead of soldiers, with interest rates instead of artillery, with currency pressure instead of occupation. But the logic remains unchanged. Who controls capital controls recovery. Who controls recovery controls the future. The hidden winners of World War I did not celebrate victory in parades. They wrote contracts, they issued loans, they structured systems, and long after the trenches were filled and the graves forgotten, their influence remained. This is why history matters. Not because it tells us what happened, but because it explains why the world works the way it does. Understanding World War I is not about the past. It is about recognizing patterns that still govern your money, your job, your country, and your future. And perhaps the most unsettling truth of all, the greatest victories in history are often invisible. No flags, no monuments, no endings, just systems that endure. If this documentary changed how you see history, money, and power, subscribe to this channel, because the next story will reveal another hidden chapter, one that still shapes your life today, whether you see it or not. This is not just history. This is the system you live inside.